Okay, so I have a confession to make. And keep in mind, I say this as an ordained minister of some 37 years duration. Here we go. I don't really get the big deal about that prayer variously known as the Lord's Prayer, or for Catholics known as the Our Father. I mean, it's a great prayer, but I don't really understand why it is so ever-present as to be almost a universal part of the wider culture. It is counterintuitively said almost always at 12-step meetings, which make a big point of being open to all or no religions. I suspect it's known by most everyone in our culture, although I'm not sure about the generations coming up in our increasingly secular world. Anyway, my point is, and I mean this with all due respect, that it has never really spoken deeply to me. I never particularly broadcast that in my 35 years of active Christian ministry, but I was comforted when a friend told me that his priest of a progressive Benedictine stripe also acknowledged this once from the pulpit. Then that priest went on to make what I found to be a heck of a point. He said that the church at large had missed the boat in making this prayer our bread and butter, because the whole point is that it was the Lord's Prayer, Jesus' prayer, that is, and that the real challenge for each of us is to write our own life's prayer, our own credo, perhaps like the one by William Ellery Channing entitled My Symphony, which goes like this: to live content with small means, to seek elegance rather than luxury and refinement rather than fashion, to be worthy and respectable and wealthy, not rich, to study hard, think quietly, talk gently, act frankly, to listen to stars, birds, babies, and sages with open heart, to bear all cheerfully and do all bravely, await occasions, hurry never, in a word, to let the spiritual, unbidden, and unconscious grow up through the common. This is to be my symphony. Lovely. But back to my friend's Benedictine priests, who suggested that part of our life's work might be to boil down everything we believe and most cherish into a brief creed or prayer. It could change over time and would grow with us as we age, until finally, as wise elders, it would be honed and polished into a truly beautiful representation of our lives, our beliefs and values, all that we hope to stand for. Jesus did this and came up with a statement that beautifully expressed his whole purpose within his historical setting. But rather than adapting his or Channing's or anyone else's, the better challenge would be for each of us to figure out our own. And then, as Paul exhorted, to think on these things, to meditate on them and allow them to center us and give us life and empower us to be agents of joy and justice in the world. And that's what I'm trying to do in this sermon. Mind you, it won't be quite as brief a statement as Jesus or Channing's. Catch me on my deathbed if you want the boiled down version. I'm young enough at 64 to still be a bit wordy. But as a now retired clergy person who has moved into my last third of life, and that's if you do the math optimistically, I find myself increasingly thinking along these lines, wanting to start boiling things down and summing them up. And so I give you this morning a stab at my own credo. Here are a handful of things I've learned along the way that have been most helpful, most meaningful, and most transformative on my journey. I will invite you to take what you like and leave the rest, eat the meat and spit out the bones. I offer them in random order. First of all, boiled down to a nutshell, I believe the purpose of each of our individual lives is to grow up or evolve into the most whole and authentic version of whomever God or the universe or life created each of us to be. Now, that's not a matter of perfectionism unless you understand that the word perfect in the Hebraic sense means whole, as opposed to the Greek sense, which means without blemish. I believe our purpose as humans is to grow in wholeness of soul, soul being shorthand for the amalgamation of our bodies, minds, emotions, psyches, and spirits. To grow into the fullness of those, and then to take our place in the wider world to become agents of love, joy, and justice for everybody. It's something like a symphony. Everyone has a part. Without each of our unique and beautiful lines in the score, the symphony is the poorer. So our purpose is soul making, and all the circumstances and events of our lives are part of it. Not that God or anything premeditates what happens to us in order to teach us, but given that life just happens, all of it becomes part of the river that hews and smooths the stones. Ironically, death is the final piece to this process of soul making. I stumbled on an old quote by Joseph Campbell from The Power of Myth this week that says it beautifully. Quote, "The problem in middle life, when the body has reached its climax of power and begins to decline, is to identify yourself not so much with the body, which is beginning to fall away, but with the consciousness of which the body is a vehicle. This is something I learned from myths," says Campbell. What am I? Am I the bulb that carries the light? Or am I the light of which the bulb is a vehicle? One of the psychological problems in growing old is the fear of death. People resist the door of death. But this body is a vehicle of consciousness. And if you can identify with the consciousness or soul, you can watch this body go like an old car. There goes the fender. There goes the tire. One thing after another. But it's predictable. And then gradually the whole thing drops off, and consciousness or soul rejoins consciousness. It's just no longer just in this particular environment. Wow, that's some good stuff there. Next, an essential part of our soul making, or at least mine, is learning to love the inner child who, because of inevitable parental limitation, didn't get everything she or he needed as a toddler or a child. Now, I hesitated to include this one because it has become so cliche. If you remember Stuart Smalley in Saturday Night Live from maybe the 90s, making fun of pop psychology, self-help culture run amok with his crying, whiny victimization. But for me, loving and nurturing the inner child, soothing the baby, to put it most bluntly, has been an essential part in growing in wholeness. I don't know about you, but I feel stress in the pit of my stomach. And when I sense it, I try to place my hand there and direct warmth and love to that scared inner place, that place of hardness. I try to just be with it in love, as I tried to be with my child when he was a scared or upset toddler. I know it sounds simplistic and cliche, but I find it really helpful. And so this Mother's Day, I exhort us all to nurture our inner child, no matter how old we may be. This dovetails naturally with my next affirmation, which is finding the balance between having all the feelings and then being able to let them go. You cannot let go of what you never had to begin with. So it seems to me that if we find ourselves habitually beset by big, troubling feelings of anxiety or sadness or anger, or even milder versions of things like restlessness, irritability, and discontent, we need, first of all, to learn to stay with those feelings, accept them, tend to them, in short, feel them, and find a safe way to express them. These big feelings partially tend to run along gender lines, although of course there are always exceptions. But women in our culture have tended to be socialized to not be angry, men to not be scared or sad. Part of growing in wholeness as women is finding our angry voice. For men, it is in incorporating repressed vulnerability. But then equally important to taking all the time one needs to have the feelings comes eventually the time for letting them go, letting the thunderstorm pass, which it always does. In the words of Maya Angelou, every cloud runs out of rain. Or another cliche, but still the truest thing I know, this too shall pass. Now, this is not a matter of trying to force a letting go, but more a matter of allowing it to happen in its own time, like the leaves gently drifting from the autumn trees. You know how that happens? During the spring and summer, the tree secretes a substance that keeps the leaves attached. But in response to waning light and cooling temperatures, the tree stops secreting that substance, and the leaves just let go naturally. This is not to say it is easy or a one-time event to let go. I recently heard a great line about resentment. I believe in forgive and forget, except when I forget I forgave and relapse back to blind rage. Sometimes it takes a lot of letting go before it sticks. But eventually, I think our challenging feelings move along when we simply stop actively energizing them. This leads to my next point, which is the power of our own minds, our own thoughts, in partially creating our experience. Who has not had the experience of misunderstanding or misinterpreting something someone else said, usually in a negative way, then responding negatively or defensively, which then evokes that kind of response in them, even if it wasn't there in the first place. And before you know it, a whole straw scenario has been created based on nothing but the power of our own thought. This is not to say that our own thinking is the only thing that creates experience. There are events in our lives which are just plain tragic, for example, and response with grief is inevitable and healthy. But it is to say that sometimes we worsen our own suffering by overthinking. In the words of the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, "Oh, the mind has mountains, cliffs of fall, frightful, sheer, no one fathomed. Hold them cheap may who ne'er hung there." Sometimes when I am most overwhelmed by life, I need to stand back, try to gain some perspective, and see how my own sometimes compulsive thinking or reactions are creating my reality and worsening my suffering. Another cliche that has become very important to me is the importance of mindfulness to the present moment. One of my greatest temptations in life is to live a skip or a beat ahead of myself, sending out an inner scout to make sure the lay of the land is safe for tomorrow or 2 minutes from now. The upshot is I am fragmented and miss the full joy of experiencing the now in a centered and unified way. I especially love the way the writer Robert Pirsig of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance fame got at it when he talked about his decision to drive only secondary roads when traveling, thereby opting for a journey of small towns and real people and soulful experiences, as opposed to the generic and sanitized rest stops on the interstate highways. He said it was the difference between making good time and making time good. Another benefit to living in the present is that you get to be more free of worry. I think it was Mark Twain who said, "I have suffered much misery in my life, some of which actually happened." And my friend Dan says, "Don't tell me worrying doesn't do any good. 99% of what I worry about never happens." Another important insight along my journey has been that we exist in community and that ultimately we cannot, as individuals, be fully whole until everyone's needs are met. I said in the introduction to this sermon that our purpose is to grow into wholeness and then to take our place in the wider world to be agents of love, joy, and justice for all. It's not enough to become whole just for our own sake. We are bound together as individuals and built to take our place in the wider community to work for justice, which Niebuhr said is just love working out its problems. In Christianity, we call it creating the kingdom or the realm of God. And of course, we can't do it solely on our own power. We need God's power and presence to work through us. But we are called to create little glimpses of the realm of God here and now by reaching out to the poor, the disenfranchised, those without power and resources. This can take any number of forms: volunteerism, financial support of good causes, activism to change policies, simply doing for a neighbor in need. The point is that humanity is a collective, and nobody's truly in a good place until everybody is. We are to be people of love and justice for all people. Faith without works is dead. That's why I'm so impressed with your once a month worship Sunday. What a great way to put bones on that idea. Anne Lamott said, "Nobody gets into heaven without a letter of recommendation from the poor." Now, I'm not sure that's literally true, but the point is well taken in any case. Finally, and probably the most important, is my belief in the centrality of love. Medieval mystic Julian of Norwich said, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, for there is a force in the universe that holds us fast and will never let us go." Dr. King said, "I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality." I remember reading once, and I can't give you the exact reference because of my aging memory and despite a thorough Google search, but I read that a prominent scientist with spiritual sensitivities, maybe Teilhard de Chardin or Thomas Keating, said that when you boiled life down to its smallest elements, smaller than molecules and atoms and even quarks, that at the core of it all is something like a string vibrating with love. Indeed, despite the fact that it gets distorted and has been twisted time and again throughout history, I believe that the heart of the universe is gracious and that there is a force, a silent working of good, God, if you will, trying to lure the whole thing further up the path of love. It's in us, and we're in it, and it moves through and among us in community, and it's the strongest thing in the universe. So there you have it, my credo. At 10 pages, this was decidedly longer and far more humble than the Lord's Prayer or Channing Symphony. I'll keep honing it down as I traverse the last third. But even more importantly, I want to encourage you to give some thought to your own life's prayer or credo or symphony. What do you believe is most important? What do you cherish, and from where do you draw nourishment? What are the life-giving things you can contemplate on a daily basis, as Paul suggested in Philippians? The point is, don't take Jesus or Channing's word for it, and most certainly not my own, but come to your own conclusions as you continue the deep and creative process of soul making. May you know joy and enact justice as you navigate the journey.